hangout. As you can see, we're all in the same room, so hopefully that will allow us to get over some of the technical issues today. I'd like to welcome you all online. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping, and apologies because it's on my phone. I didn't remember it off the top of my head. So, welcome to today's Hangout. This is a monthly Google Hangout series hosted by UNHCR Innovation and Plus Social Good. It's meant to spark conversations on innovation in the humanitarian sector. Each month we broadcast topics on innovating for good, and each Hangout carries its own topic. On this fifth Hangout, live from Istanbul and the World Humanitarian Summit, we bring an amazing panel that we will discuss today. So welcome everyone. So just to frame this Hangout, it's in line with the core responsibilities of the WHS, the World Humanitarian Summit, which focuses on people at the center. And the recommendations encourage humanitarians to embrace the opportunities of the 21st century, but what does this look like in practice? How can effective partnerships between humanitarian agencies, technical providers, and local actors be best forged? We'll speak about radical openness in partnership that enabled Google, Mercy Corps, ThoughtWorks, and our partner who's not with us today, Translators Without Borders, to support each other in a humanitarian response. But before I open for questions, if you're following the conversation online, please make sure that you use the hashtag INNOV4GOOD, so that's INNOV and then the number 4 good on Twitter. You can tweet our panelists any questions and we'll get to them in the second half of our conversation. So without much further ado, I'll introduce the panelists and then I'll start. So today we have John Warnes, who's a technology officer with UNHCR Innovation. He's the emergency lab technology officer, my partner in crime, and we've been working in partnership with these guys. I have Pete Genke from Google. Thank you very much for joining us. Also Natasha Jimenez from ThoughtWorks. Thanks again. And last but not least, Jeff Wishner. So I'm going to start with Jeff, but it's a question to all of you. This is a term that I've heard him used a lot over the past 5 months. Radical openness in partnership. What does it mean, Jeff?
Well, it means a lot of different things, but fundamentally it means putting aside organizational concerns, a wide range of them, and fears about exposing your work before it's perfect, so that you can do your work out in the open and encourage in. And really, it's about being willing to partner with anybody who shares at least what we achieve, and is essentially willing to help out and proves themselves to be competent. So doors are open to everybody. And we can talk a little bit about how you actually find partners, how we found each other, this group of partners. But a big part of it is actually doing your work out in the open and in the public so people find you.
Great, thank you. So Pete, can we come to you? What does radical openness mean to you in partnership?
Everything that Jeff said. But really, I think it's about the sort of informality of the work. It's the kind of sharing, like, that vision and sort of being on the same page. And just having an open communication channel that's worked really well for us, and being able to, in kind of real time, just talk about ideas, share plans, write up docs, and just make them kind of like by default open and available for everyone to kind of chime in on, and kind of a community sort of vetting process to kind of figure out where everyone is going. So I would say just default open, informal, and lots of communication.
Natasha, is there anything you'd like to add about radically open partnerships, I should say?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a key thing for this project, and just allowing anyone that's passionate about it to join in has been really helpful.
Great. John?
I think for me, one of the key things about having sort of a radically open partnership is the fact that you're looking outwards almost before you look inwards. You're not thinking immediately about what you're going to do yourself, but actually you're looking at who's doing what else, who can we talk to actually push things forward before you start working out how you fit into that picture. Because actually a lot of the things that we come up with that are not working is because we're being too introspective, and actually being outwardly looking really helps us forge these partnerships, build these partnerships, and be open to them. And that's when we then become default to public, default to editable, and so on and so forth.
Well, that all sounds very rosy and quite easy, but obviously not without its challenges. So maybe let's have a perspective from the corporate sector, if I may sort of couch to that. What have been some of the challenges that you've had in terms of this corporate humanitarian partnership? Can you describe sort of some of the pain points, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I would say like general kind of partnership pain points that we've had in the past is that some organizations do not sort of operate at the same kind of velocity that the other organizations might. For instance, at Google we like to fail fast. We like to move very quickly, and like get something into the for our team. We like to get things out into the open very quickly. And some organizations may or may not be able to kind of operate at that same speed, or they might not share the same things should be default by open mindset. And so organizationally, we have to kind of figure out how to kind of work and integrate those partners that are not able to kind of share the same design and like velocity.
But if I add something to that, I think every organization has their internal structure. So what's been really great about this partnership is that all of our organizations have slightly different ones. And so when somebody's had sort of a hang up to getting the work done and getting it out into the hands of the field and the field workers, somebody else has been able to step in and help with that. So Pete, actually getting the app out into the App Store was something that is difficult for Google to do for completely valid reasons around what it means to have a Google promoted app versus an application that's put together by volunteers or a group like us. So it was nice that Mercy Corps actually doesn't really know any apps, and therefore we had no restrictions. We were able to take the work and get it out. So I think there have been times where every organization has hit a little bit of a potential friction, and we've been able to step in and use the fact that each organization is different to out in the open, nothing hidden, but kind of work around the different problems that each organization has.
Yeah, I think it requires that open and frank discussion about what you can and can't do. And actually, I think sometimes maybe we focus internally within our organizations about what we can't do, rather than actually what we can do. So even though you may have a bureaucracy, let's say, preventing you from publishing an app, but you say, well, we can't do that, but we can do all of this. Now, who else can do some of these other things? And that's where you start to come together about all the things that you can do. So rather than being negative about it, you can be very optimistic and say, this is what we're going to bring these sorts of things, because we know that this is within our power and things that we can push forward.
Yeah, and I think in terms of ThoughtWorks and the technical end, it's really important that we support sourcing the code was really important, and we were able to get a lot of other people to join in on that.
And I think open sourcing code is critical to collaboration because it removes all sorts of friction and barriers to people jumping on. It just makes it very easy for people to jump in and work, even if you intend to be collaborative and let people in. If it's private and you have licenses and agreements around it, it might take you time in your legal group to get permission to another person to come in. So someone might be in there, they're able to help, whereas if it's open source, they're interested, you point them to the code and they can start helping immediately.
To Jeff's point about the the kind of synergy of the different organizations working together, on the crisis response team in the past, we've open sourced a number of projects. We didn't put the commensurate level in kind of like partnership building around the project as we did the code development. And those projects that have been open source historically have not been Translation Cards and Crisis Hub, another project that we had developed. And so that's been a real lesson learned for us, is that it's not just enough to open source it. You also have to kind of build that network of partners to really sort of like leverage and kind of like give your project wings and take it out to the community.
I was going to say, so in terms of partnerships in an emergency, I guess there's always a lot of enthusiasm or impetus at the time of the emergency, and sometimes we see that sort of fade over time, potentially, especially in a rapid onset. So in terms of sustaining that partnership, what do you think are the important sort of contributing factors? I don't know, John, whether you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I think one of the important things really when you're looking at sort of taking a project and making it open source or designing it from open source is actually a lot of it's about turnover in a way, in that you have essentially a lot of this project runs around champions, and people embracing the solution, but then people will inevitably leave. And I think that as part of this, we need to realize that people will go, but that we need new people coming in. And I think this is really where being sort of outwardly looking, trying to bring new developers into the project is really, really vital and really helps keep it alive over a sustained period of time.
Great, thanks. Just to say, I know some people are having trouble following us online because our signal's a little bit choppy. I guess that's some of the challenges of having 6,000 people extra in Istanbul for the World Humanitarian Summit. And also, you'll have had a doorbell because we're currently doing this from a hotel room. So I'm very sorry about the technical, bear with us. And if you're having trouble following us on the audio video feed, you can also follow us via Twitter as well. So in terms of the challenges and the sustainability, I didn't know whether any of you had an extra point that you wanted to come in on.
Yeah, I'll throw in on that. I think that any any project, any technology that you're putting in the field, it gets sustained primarily by being useful, by people finding utility in it. And when you're operating in an open fashion where anybody who finds utility in something can contribute, that goes a long way toward achieving what John's talking about, where everybody involved on the project today will have other projects and life will intervene, and eventually their interest or their ability to contribute will wane. But if it's useful to other people and we're open to allowing them to contribute, then other people will come in. And if in a year or two it's not in use because it's not useful anymore, that's fine. And if it does grow in utility, then we'll see it stick around. And going back to friction and difficulties, one thing I found at Mercy Corps that I was a bit surprised by, because Mercy Corps is a very kind of agile, low process organization, is that when we got to the point of having an alpha that we wanted to try, our agile field teams were agilely very busy with other things. And it really was critical that we met you folks and UNHCR Innovation, because you were in a place where you wanted to take a tool like this to the field. And I expected that Mercy Corps would be taking it to the field, but that actually became a barrier on our side. And you brought it to the field, put it in real use, and got direct feedback much quicker than we've been able to.
So on that point, I've actually got a question coming in from Rati, and it says, how best can we take innovation out of labs and embed it into programs? Staff often complain that they have no time to innovate. John, you're in a lab. How do we get innovation out of the lab and
out of the lab?
Yeah.
So I think that we are the culprits. No, I think what it's about is really it's not necessarily what is happening, but it's kind of how it's happening. And I think that there's nothing in principle wrong with innovation labs or any other model, but it's really about how the people in these labs, how they go about their work and how they relate to humanitarian responders on the ground, not only within their organization, but outside of the organization. And often I see the role more as, rather than an implementer, you're more of a broker or a convener around the people who are doing this as part of their everyday work in the field. And one thing that we were doing in Macedonia recently with this project Translation Cards that we're discussing kind of partially in other collaborations between the different agencies is about actually sort of training our field teams, helping support them in identifying the challenges, and also then providing them with more expertise and skills to identify solutions that really fit their needs and fit the needs of the people they're trying to serve.
So Natasha, I didn't know whether you had any ideas, because obviously the technical capacity that ThoughtWorks has, how do we make sure that we can really get that out of Silicon Valley and get it to the hands of the people who need it, our field staff? How can we really make sure that we're sharing this knowledge and expertise?
Yeah, I think organizations definitely need to dedicate some time to projects like these. I think it's really valuable. I also think this conference and our participation in it has helped the team with onboarding new people and figuring out how to quickly onboard people to keep them interested, and how that process, like we had to onboard several people within 24 hours and get them to deliver something valuable, and we had to prepare for that to be able to have that be a smooth process. And I think that will help us in the future, and just to have that process thought out for these projects is really important.
Pete, did you want to say something on that sort of the skills exchange, technical exchange that the corporate and the humanitarian sector can have, speaking from Google's perspective?
Yeah, I think again, I think just we're sort of sitting in, Mountain View, California, doing a lot of this development, and New York City, but we're, very much divorced from like the actual sort of like field work. And I think, again, to Jeff's past point about, making it real, to kind of sustain the, level of energy across the group. For Google, being able to get that real-time feedback from the field has really energized the network of volunteers at Google supporting the translation cards project. And so I think that just really highlights, the merits of kind of release early and release often, get it into the hands of people, like get that feedback coming in real time, get them excited, get their feedback, just so that, it's something that actually has traction, and that you're, continuing to work to make your users happy and finding new users. So that, this kind of collaboration has really been, us in Mountain View kind of doing our part in the kind of like prototyping and then, getting it onto the field. So really the need for a partnership to enable this project to be successful.
Yeah, just to add on top of that, I think something Pete's alluding to there is actually some of the tools that we're using to actually make this happen really speed things up. So one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes through these processes of having sort of, let's say, technical teams and development expertise and field staff, there's often levels of hierarchy and levels of sort of in-betweens between these two components. And actually what's really important is actually to bring these two as close together as possible. And I think the thing that we experienced was actually we were using tools that are freely available online, like Slack and Google Drive, to actually help bridge this divide. So when Katie and I were actually in Macedonia doing some of this field testing, we could fill that back into the Slack channel and send it to developers within a matter of minutes from hearing it from the mouth of a refugee, or even in real time. And that, I think, is really valuable because changes can be made very fast to the code base and so on that we can immediately put into effect in field testing.
There's something implicit in the way that we've been working together that I think is worth making explicit. That is kind of a prerequisite condition for that kind of communication. The tools are very helpful with it, but fundamentally there's a shared respect among the organizations and a sense of equality or equivalency. So there isn't a sense that the developers are somehow, the staff back at HQ who are in a supporting role, or that the people in the field are the the junior frontline workers. Everybody we expect everyone to be open for people in the field to comment on technical aspects of the application and whatnot, along with the typical things we would want, like whether it's useful or not. And so we don't have I don't think we've ever talked about anybody's title or seniority in an organization, or whether field work should be subservient to innovation work or development work should be subservient. We're all together working on a project. In tools like Slack, where we're all in the same space, talking without any sense of those levels, I think encourages that interaction.
And I think also another tool that has been very helpful with the continuous deployment has been Snap CI, which is a tool we use for continuous delivery, and we can quickly build the whole project and create a signed APK and release it to the App Store within the day. And then we also create a version of the project where we upload it to Slack. We can upload it directly to everyone, and they can look it over and approve it and see if it's the version we want to upload to the App Store, and we can do that within the next day. So it's been very good, like continuous delivery.
So on that, and I know that this is a question that came in last time we had a Google Hangout, how can we make sure that this isn't just, I mean, we're talking about a radical partnership, but this is still sort of the same old the UN. Where is the refugee voice in this, and what can we do to make sure that we're really sort of enabling them to be part of this process? And this is definitely one of the recommendations that's coming strongly out of the World Humanitarian Summit, and often a question of where is the refugee voice in this hangout, in the development of the product, and maybe how can we make sure that they're engaged in these online platforms, these tools. Pete, did you want to come to that point?
Yeah, it's a very valid a very valid point that you raise about the refugee voice, and I think for us our charge is really to identify additional partners that are working in the field that can bring us that refugee voice. We're staying in Mountain View and New York and San Francisco and Dallas, and we're very much far removed from like the actual like European and Mediterranean and Middle East, and so it's up to us to kind of like promote this project and again, yeah, find the partners that are willing to work with the refugees, bring them into Slack, and be a conduit for getting the needs of the refugee into the kind of like feature request list for the project.
And there are so far that have included the refugees who we're trying to support with the tools. So the original idea developed out of research and conversations with Middle Eastern refugees on Lesbos, and the field testing that UNHCR Innovation has done has been in conversation with refugees and feeding back their views. I do think that this particular crisis, with people moving so quickly and not being in one place for very long, has made it particularly difficult to engage people on an ongoing basis. And for better or for worse, probably for worse, things have changed and people are stuck. And it may really, that actually, I mean, it's bad for them, but it opens a small opportunity on the project where we can reach out to people and invite them, as Pete was saying, into the conversation, right into Slack, get their direct feedback, as long as we all do our business in English. Mm-hmm. And I know there are a lot of refugees who speak English along with their native language. And so if we can find people who are interested in the project, I think we should just bring them right in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that point about Ollie, who is another worker from Google, going to the field, I think, again, for me, it's about this proximity. It really is about proximity. And, a lot of humanitarian agencies, be them NGOs or UN agencies, are working every day with these people and are listening and working with them all the time. Now, what the problem is often these conversations, they remain isolated at field level and never transfer to other areas of these organizations or leave that area, and that's particularly where often tech development is a bit disassociated from this process of field work that our staff do every day. And I think that, by actually having developers being able to go there, see the challenges from themselves, but also that field workers are more in tune with relaying what they're getting through these conversations about the protection work maybe that they're doing on a day-to-day basis to other parts of the organization. It helps bring this proximity from not just the staff, but the organization as a whole and other humanitarian responders closer to the people we're trying to serve, to listen to their voices and build our solutions from the most simple to the most technologically advanced around their real needs.
Okay, I've got a question coming in from Twitter, directed at Pete from Emily. Thanks, Emily. How will Google CR help make enabling conditions for refugees to work, to contribute to the work that you're doing, and to help them rebuild their lives in their first countries of refuge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for us, it's really kind of understanding refugee needs, understanding what it is that Google as a company can do to support their journey and their kind of transition. I think we talked about I flew to Europe last summer with the idea of how can Google help out the refugee situation, and the issue that we had is that we had really kind of no sense of what the on the ground needs were, and we had no idea what products to build. And so having Ollie Parshi, our researcher, go to Lesbos, identified some of the ways in which we Google and we in collaboration with partners could develop solutions to help these refugees, and that kind of field research is continuing. We are working in Turkey to talk with refugees here in Istanbul to kind of understand, so in these destination countries and transit countries, how is the web and the internet kind of working and not working for those in transit. And so I think that is an ongoing question, and we, Google and we, the community, are sort of continuing to try to better understand, what the opportunities are. And really, it's what we found is that the traditional ways that people get information, on the web, aren't really the case anymore. It's happening a lot on social media, mm-hmm. And so for a company like Google, if everything is happening in Viber and WhatsApp, that kind of forces us to think a little bit outside the box, mm-hmm. In terms of what it is that we can do. So I don't have any answers yet, except that we're continuing to do the research to know going into the future what it is that we can build.
So on that note, seeing as we're at the World Humanitarian Summit, there's a number of recommendations that have been made us, some core responsibilities that we should be taking on. But what recommendations do we want to sort of project back to the World Humanitarian Summit to take forward in terms of creating a more enabling environment for this kind of collaborative, radical partnership? Natasha, do you have any recommendations?
I think so. For the World Humanitarian Summit to take forward, recommendations for maybe private companies would be to allow employees to do their 20% time like Google or ThoughtWorks. That really helps to be able to give like free services like these to these projects.
Great. Pete, did you want to say anything about that directly, or?
Let's see. Yeah, in terms of I think corporate social responsibility really plays a part into supporting the refugee effort and larger humanitarian initiatives. And I think Natasha's point is very, very valid in terms of giving employees that time and that opportunity and the resources they need to pursue kind of like these projects in their spare time. And like Google has really afforded us on this project those working hours to kind of like do projects like this. And so and I think also like the more partners the better. We saw Facebook, we saw Airbnb, lots of kind of like new lots of new organizations are coming online like since the refugee crisis, and everyone sort of has like a unique role to play. And like I'm personally really excited about all of the all of the new discussions. Like Facebook and like Google have been frenemies for a while, and we're really becoming like more so friends, like with the the amount of communication that we're having around the refugee crisis, like the Mosul Dam. Like it's really been a sign of like the sea change in terms of all of us working together. So.
And I throw in from my experience, I've seen in my own career, I've been in the private sector and I've been in the NGO world, and I've kind of acted as a bridge between them. And I often see the social sector and the private sector talk past each other. And it often comes in the form of the private sector reaching out to the social sector and saying, we want to help, how can we help? Or the social sector reaching out to these these big powerful companies with cool technology and saying, please help us. But neither side being particularly clear on what the problem is and how to solve it. And what that defaults to are the tech companies coming with whatever it is that they have that they know well and say, oh, well, we're Google, we've got Gmail, what can you do with Gmail? It's like, maybe nothing here, maybe it doesn't really apply. And what really works, and what worked in this case, not just on the translation cards project, but on a number of projects that we've been engaged with Google and Cisco and other corporates on this, is taking the time to either the social sector can take the responsibility to really understand their problem and their need, and to go to the private sector and be very clear, this is the kind of help we need, even if it's hard. And even if it's not something that the private sector has on their shelf, but to be clear on the need and to encourage the private sector to take on things that are hard, not just easy in their CSR. But if possible, what we did in this case of actually jointly doing research, discovering the needs together, so everybody was engaged and felt ownership, it was very powerful, because when things were out of the lines, for example, for Google on the translation cards, where the existing products, the Google Translate app, for example, was not the right format for use here, rather than us going and saying, we need translation help, and Google saying, oh, we have Google Translate, and then it doesn't work, or we need translation help, we want you to rewrite a new app, and Google's like, oh, that's crazy, we've already got one. Together, we jointly came to the conclusion that there needed to be something specifically tailored in this situation. There was no arguing over it, it was just a matter of, now let's go back to our organizations and marshal forces to do this together.
And how realistic is that, John, do you think?
I mean, I think one of the things that this requires is essentially a degree of flexibility, and this runs all through from each organization or team within organizations all the way up through to donors and also the partners that you're working with. And I mean, one interesting thing about this project that we've worked on together, the translation cards, is that this fell outside the scope of all of our programming. We didn't know that it was going to happen. And that is actually one of the gifts in a way, because it gave us the flexibility, because we had no pre-arranged programming or that we were going to do, to actually adapt and move however the course was deemed necessary. And that's also important when you're listening to the voices of refugees, that you need to be able to adapt what you're doing based on that need, and that requires flexibility. And this goes all the way up through to funders and people who essentially have big decision-making power in this.
Flexibility is key then, but is that realistic, knowing the structures and the systems that we work in both the corporate side and the humanitarian side? What would be needed to catalyze and make the system more flexible from both sides?
Well, I think some organizations have a certain amount of flexibility built in. I'm familiar with ThoughtWorks. I used to work there. I understand sort of where their flexibility is, and that's one of the reasons I reached out for their help, because I felt that we had a kind of project that could fit into their kind of quick decision making about making people available to help. And I think each organization needs to develop that space internally. And I was able to do this within Mercy Corps because the technology work that I do is somewhat carved out where I have flexibility to take on projects and make the decision myself about what we're going to do and a bit of resource to spend on that. And I've personally worked on that so that we can take advantage of opportunities when they come up. And it's probably a lot harder for you two within the UN.
I think this is actually a really interesting point. It comes back to the question we received earlier actually about the usefulness of innovation labs and innovation units. Is forget about the people in the lab, but what it can do is provide a space for anybody in the organization to actually gain some of this flexibility. And I think this is what we saw with this sort of procedure, is that actually we were able to get this flexibility beyond the normal sort of standard programming that UNHCR was doing, which, while very important, because we had this space in innovation. So I do think that it's not just in the sort of, let's say, protocol of labs or anything, but you're starting to see these spaces open up more and more as we're developing it. Sometimes they take the guise of innovation labs, sometimes they're baked into technology divisions, or there are many different ways that it can work, but I think they're growing, and I think people in the organizations need to think outwardly and think, if I don't have the space, where can I find the space?
And do you think, Pete, because I know we had this discussion before on a previous occasion, that there's something that can be done in preparedness, so that it's sort of like pre-laying some of the groundwork, so that when a rapid onset crisis happens, that we already know, oh, I know who to call, because the fact that Jeff used to work with ThoughtWorks is obviously sort of a key factor of this partnership.
Mm-hmm.
What more can be done from that preparedness angle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the true benefits of meetings like the World Humanitarian Summit, and some of these are initiatives to kind of bring people together, are the investment in relationships. And I've certainly valued going to these events and being able to just to meet folks and put faces to names. And I would say though, at the same time, I had never met John, and I hadn't met Jeff or Natasha before any of this, and we relied on sort of like the matchmaker Jeff to kind of connect the dots. And so it's sort of like making sure that you know the right people and that you're talking to the right organizations, and just kind of relying on that kind of Rolodex of people and people and initiatives to kind of help expand just expand that pool of people that you can pull in when something happens. And like at the hackathon that we had, for instance, so we now have a number of new people that we can call on to sort of help us out. And so any of these, I think events like this hangout are fantastic. Hackathons, virtual, doesn't have to be in person, but just dedicated time that you can just get to know people virtually, in person, so that when something does happen, there's kind of process and email addresses in place that you can ping and annoy.
It may sound really old-fashioned, but I completely agree that it fundamentally comes down to personal relationships, and some are easy to make, and I think we met over I don't know how many people conference call. There was kind of a standard, let's agencies get together and say what they're doing, but kind of immediately had a good feel for each other, and then very quickly went into doing work. And in the future, whatever organizations any of you end up at, because we've done this work together and know each other, those are going to be connections. And to what John was saying, I think that finding that space to be able to, that flexibility to be able to make decisions, and perhaps the structure of a lab being really one way in which you set the expectation that people should be able to make decisions that are not pre-planned, sort of jump on the opportunity. Combine that with networks of people who know each other, and that's where you can move quickly.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as well that a key part of at least ThoughtWorks engagement with this was that we were very flexible with our timeline to it. And that was in part lucky, but also a bit, we got protection on this project. But I think at the beginning we were just brought on to open source the project. So if we'd been very rigid about like, that's all we're going to do, then we wouldn't have been able to continue to contribute to it. And so we were kind of very flexible in where the project was going, and we're continuing to be flexible with like changing it based on the needs that we're seeing emerging from the field.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing actually, and it's almost more of a question maybe to the rest of the group, is that, you know, on the one hand we're looking for efficiencies and ways to save time, but actually with this personal relationships component being so important, how do you sort of cross bringing these people together to allow these relationships to develop, which you can call on when you're in the field, when you're listening to, you know, to the people we're all trying to help, to make things happen really fast. But then obviously you have to make the investment in advance in these relationships to allow for these things to blossom when the time comes, because if you don't necessarily have the connections or the right sort of engagement with, let's say, corporate actors or, you know, interesting new startups. So I think that's, for me, is a real question, and I think that maybe when organizations are thinking about how they sort of are dividing the worker pool, how they're putting their profiles together, they actually need to have, let's say, a greater link between what's going on the ground and global sort of development of how the sector's looking and where other organizations are doing work. And I think that bringing those two things closer together, so field up to global level and global level down to the field, is a really helpful thing that organizations can do.
I think that's a really great question, John, but I guess one of the challenges then is we're talking about informality and flexibility and individual relationships, and how do we then slightly structure and formalize it so that we can really bring the sort of ground and field voices much closer to the global level without it feeling too much like a process, too much like a bureaucracy. And I guess that's the fundamental challenge. I don't know whether, Jeff, did you have sort of a way of addressing that, or?
There's not a magic wand for it. I think some of the structures that we have, like conferences and opportunities to get together, are valuable, but nothing builds relationship and partnership better than doing work together. And so being opportunistic about finding small projects, you know, translation cards in the grand scheme of things, a fairly small project. But in the end, the most valuable part of it may be the networks and the relationships that have been built that can be activated in future projects. So I think actively looking for those opportunities to work together on something concrete that is used by the field. You know, exercises, just going back to, I think it was Arati who asked the question about, you know, how do you get innovation out of the lab? And what I would say to that is, if it's in the lab, it's not innovation. Innovation is actually at least three things. It's an idea, probably a new idea, or new to you at least, an implementation of that idea, which means it's in the field, and then the critical thing is it's an implementation that has succeeded. And maybe it's taken you years of refining it to get it to succeed, but oftentimes people confuse, and they think an innovation is a nifty idea that someone did a TED Talk about that no one's ever built, or something that people built that ended up in the field and no one really used. Those aren't innovations; those are ideas. And so I think that these innovation labs, one thing they can do with this kind of proliferation in the organization is come up with ideas, but then work together to create those opportunities to actually build them, put them in the field, see if they're useful, and that kind of will, you know, helps advance two goals. One is turning innovation from a fuzzy thing that really isn't innovation into something that's concrete in the field and useful. And also, we're going to find infinite opportunities to work together and collaborate if we're actually working to get things, ideas out of the lab and turn them into innovations in the field.
So Pete, how do we move beyond innovation as a concept, and what's Google's role in that?
I would just like push back a tiny bit on John's point number 3, that innovation is like a successful implementation. When I look at Google Glass, like Google Glass was, you know, maybe not the world's like biggest like runaway hit, you know, but certainly it was something that's inspired like a next generation of sort of like wearables, and the same thing for like the first generation of some of the like Android watches that, you know, have gone out. And so I think they are innovative, and like they're inspiring additional, you know, innovators or like entrepreneurs into like exploring the space further. And so like I think it's fine like to fail, and you could still be innovative, and like I've had a zillion failures and I still feel a little bit innovative. So yeah, I think like I agree. I think there's three things, but I think that there can be success or it can be failure.
Freedom to fail, Natasha. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I actually definitely agree with that, and that's something that they really support, at least at ThoughtWorks, is they say fail fast, so it's okay to fail, and it's actually a part of the process to reach success, hopefully, at some point.
My small tweak, because I don't want people to think that I'm not a fan of failure. I mean, if you know me and know my life, I'm quite good at it. My terminology is I would call that an attempted innovation. And I'm totally happy to have attempted innovations that fall on their face. And one of the reasons I do it is I think that we have a tendency in the social sector to claim victory on things that have been failures. And I'd like us to, and that gets really confusing. You find people replicating failures that have been reported as successes. I like to be really clear on it, and I think that an attempted innovation that didn't work, that may be the basis of further refinement, and that later becomes a successful innovation. And I'd like to reserve innovation for the things that make the change happen.
I think maybe a way that we could sort of reframe that might be thinking more about impact rather than success and failure, because that's very binary. Even if it's a failure, you get many things out of it, a lot of learning and so on and so forth. But I think that when you think about impact, even if you have a failure, you may have an impact in the environment or with the people that you're trying to serve, or even for your own organization. There are lots of different levels and types of ways that impact can come to the fore. But if you're having no impact, that to me really would make me question the essence of that innovation, or whatever it may be, and really make me think that it's maybe being too top down and not bottom up enough around really trying to look at a solution that's going to really address a challenge, which is going to make an impact on people's lives.
And I think also, in terms of humanitarian work, you have to be very careful with like this idea of failure and going in. Like I've seen a lot of projects go into communities and then fail and give them a lot of hope, and then so like for this project we had partnerships with UNHCR, and you guys kind of have those relationships built and know how to go about that. So I think that's definitely something really important to be careful about in like innovative projects.
So that was going to be my final question. Like, is it fair to fail in an emergency? I mean, this is an emergency setting. We're talking about humanitarian needs, and we're also talking about space for failure. So I don't know whether that's a big final question to sort of end on, but it would be great to sort of hear from each one of our hangouters.
I'm laughing because there's the implication that we don't fail even when we're not trying to innovate. I mean, we unfortunately we fail in emergency all the time, and we try not to. But I think we all understand the concept of responsible risk-taking, and we have to be clear about that. Something like translation cards, if we get the translations wrong, it might be a humorous moment, or it might even make an individual angry because we said something in a rude way. That's about as far as it's going to go. If we're talking, life-saving, potentially life-saving or ending medical devices, then it's going to be a very different level of refinement and testing before we put something in the field.
Yeah, I 101% agree with. We're on the same page. For Google in the crisis response space, I think we're very willing to fail when it comes out to pushing authoritative, official, up-to-date information in sort of new ways that we haven't before. For instance, like for Cyclone Winston, we pushed out now cards to users in Fiji, and we had hundreds of views of that information, and that wasn't in Google terms like the most impactful thing that we've ever done. But that's a something, a risk that we're willing to take to try that. But in terms of taking a risk on, we're not certain about the veracity of this information. That's sort of kind of risk that we're not willing to take when it really comes down to to someone's life.
Risk-taking, John.
I think that the way I might almost frame it is that you can innovate in emergencies if you're taking a radically open approach. And I think that that's because you're thinking more about what's going on outside of what you're doing before you're thinking about what you're doing, which means that even if you start to do something along the wrong track, if you're listening, you can modify and adapt that based on the needs of your staff and the people you're trying to serve. And I think that that's where, you know, being frank and open about what you're planning to do, the work that you're doing, and actually have that open in public, it allows for people to comment on this, modify it, bring in their expertise as you're moving along. And I think that radical openness is actually a critical part of being able to innovate in emergencies, because when things are done behind closed doors, that's when things get dangerous, because things take on their own life, and not, you know, all of the different organizations and things, they don't know what's going on. But actually, if everything's open on the table, everybody, including the refugees themselves, have an ability to edit, modify, update, and change the kind of work that you're doing. And if you're listening, you'll change it accordingly.
And you move at a pace that you couldn't otherwise. Because when you're asleep, somebody else is adding to your work. And when you would otherwise be waiting to polish something for weeks and weeks before you put it out, it's out there and people are working with it and improving it. And that's one of the things that's impressed me most in the work on the refugee movement through Europe, is that we've moved very, very quickly because we've been working together.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that's all we've got time for. Please do continue the discussion online. So the handle is #Innov4Good. You can also have a look on the YouTube channel. So that's the Plus Social Good YouTube channel, or UNHCR Innovation YouTube channel as well. Next month we'll have another hangout. Hopefully the connectivity will be a lot better, because ironically we were going to be talking about connectivity in rural locations and rural communities. So please do join us for that, and we really look forward to the continuing discussion online. So thank you very much, everyone, for trying to join us and staying with us through the patchiness. Great, thank you.
Thank you.